Chapter 16 of The Education of Henry Adams by Henry Adams. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. The Press, 1868. At 10 o'clock of a July night, in heat that made the tropical rain showers simmer, the Adams family and the Motley family clambered down the side of their Cunard steamer into the government tugboat, which set them ashore in black darkness at the end of some North River pier. Had they been Tyrian traders of the year B.C. 1000, landing from a galley fresh from Gibraltar, they could hardly have been stranger on the shore of a world, so changed from what it had been 10 years before. The historian of the Dutch, no longer historian but diplomatist, started up an unknown street in company with the private secretary who had become a private citizen, in search of carriages to convey the two parties to the Brevoort House. The pursuit was arduous but successful. Toward midnight they found shelter once more in their native land. How much its character had changed, or was changing, they could not wholly know, and they could but partly feel. For that matter, the land itself knew no more than they. Society in America was always trying, almost as blindly as an earthworm, to realize and understand itself, to catch up with its own head, and to twist about in search of its tail. Society offered the profile of a long straggling caravan stretching loosely toward the prairies, its few score of leaders far in advance and its millions of immigrants, negroes, and Indians far in the rear, somewhere in archaic time. It enjoyed the vast advantage over Europe that all seemed for the moment to move in one direction, while Europe wasted most of its energy in trying several contradictory movements at once. But whenever Europe or Asia should be polarized or oriented toward the same point, America might easily lose her lead. Meanwhile, each newcomer needed to slip into a place as near the head of the caravan as possible, and needed most to know where the leaders could be found. One could divine pretty nearly where the force lay, since the last 10 years had given to the great mechanical energies, coal, iron, steam, a distinct superiority in power over the old industrial elements, agriculture, handwork, and learning. But the result of this revolution on a survivor from the '50s resembled the action of the earthworm. He twisted about in vain to recover his starting point. He could no longer see his own trail. He had become an estray, a flotsam or jetsam of wreckage, a belated reveller, or a scholar gypsy like Matthew Arnold's. His world was dead. Not a Polish Jew fresh from Warsaw or Cracow, not a furtive Jacob or Isaac still reeking of the ghetto, snarling a weird Yiddish to the officers of the customs, but had a keener instinct, an intenser energy, and a freer hand than he, American of Americans, with heaven knew how many Puritans and patriots behind him, and an education that had cost a civil war. He made no complaint, and found no fault with his time. He was no worse off than the Indians or the buffalo who had been ejected from their heritage by his own people, but he vehemently insisted that he was not himself at fault. The defeat was not due to him, nor yet to any superiority of his rivals. He had been unfairly forced out of the track, and must get back into it as best he could. One comfort he could enjoy to the full. Little as he might be fitted for the work that was before him, he had only to look at his father and Motley to see figures less fitted for it than he. All were equally survivals from the '40s, bric-a-brac from the time of Louis Philippe, stylists, doctrinaires, ornaments that had been more or less suited to the colonial architecture, but which never had much value in Desbrosses Street or Fifth Avenue. They could scarcely have earned $5 a day in any modern industry. The men who commanded high pay were, as a rule, not ornamental. Even Commodore Vanderbilt and Jay Gould lacked social charm. Doubtless the country needed ornament, needed it very badly indeed, but it needed energy still more, and capital most of all, for its supply was ridiculously out of proportion to its wants. On the new scale of power, merely to make the continent habitable for civilized people would require an immediate outlay that would have bankrupted the world. As yet no portion of the world except a few narrow stretches of Western Europe had ever been tolerably provided with the essentials of comfort and convenience. To fit out an entire continent with roads and the decencies of life would exhaust the credit of the entire planet. Such an estimate seemed outrageous to a Texan member of Congress who loved the simplicity of nature's noblemen. but the mere suggestion that a sun existed above him would outrage the self-respect of a deep-sea fish that carried a lantern on the end of its nose. From the moment that railways were introduced, life took on extravagance. Thus the belated reveller who landed in the dark at the Desbrosses Street ferry found his energies exhausted in the effort to see his own length. The new Americans, of whom he was to be one, must, whether they were fit or unfit, create a world of their own, a science, a society, a philosophy, a universe, where they had not yet created a road, or even learned to dig their own iron. They had no time for thought. They saw and could see nothing beyond their day's work. Their attitude to the universe outside them was that of a deep-sea fish. Above all, they naturally and intensely disliked to be told what to do, and how to do it, by men who took their ideas and their methods from the abstract theories of history, philosophy, or theology. They knew enough to know that their world was one of energies quite new. All this the newcomer understood and accepted, since he could not help himself, and saw that the American could help himself as little as the newcomer. But the fact remained that the more he knew, the less he was educated. Society knew as much as this, and seemed rather inclined to boast of it, at least on the stump. But the leaders of industry betrayed no sentiment, popular or other. They used without qualm whatever instruments they found at hand. They had been obliged in 1861 to turn aside and waste immense energy in settling what had been settled 1,000 years before, and should never have been revived. At prodigious expense, by sheer force, they broke resistance down, leaving everything but the mere fact of power untouched, since nothing else had a solution. Race and thought were beyond reach. Having cleared its path so far, society went back to its work and threw itself on that which stood first, its roads. The field was vast, altogether beyond its power to control offhand, and society dropped every thought of dealing with anything more than the single fraction called a railway system. This relatively small part of its task was still so big as to need the energies of a generation, for it required all the new machinery to be created: capital, banks, mines, furnaces, shops, power-houses, technical knowledge, mechanical population, together with a steady remodelling of social and political habits, ideas, and institutions, to fit the new scale and suit the new conditions. The generation between 1865 and 1895 was already mortgaged to the railways, and no one knew it better than the generation itself. Whether Henry Adams knew it or not, he knew enough to act as though he did. He reached Quincy once more, ready for the new start. His brother Charles had determined to strike for the railroads. Henry was to strike for the press, and they hoped to play into each other's hands. They had great need, for they found no one else to play with. After discovering the worthlessness of a so-called education, they had still to discover the worthlessness of so-called social connection. No young man had a larger acquaintance and relationship than Henry Adams, yet he knew no one who could help him. He was for sale in the open market. So were many of his friends. All the world knew it, and knew too that they were cheap, to be bought at the price of a mechanic. There was no concealment, no delicacy, and no illusion about it. Neither he nor his friends complained, but he felt sometimes a little surprised that, as far as he knew, no one seeking in the labor market ever so much as inquired about their fitness. The want of solidarity between old and young seemed American. The young man was required to impose himself, by the usual business methods, as a necessity on his elders, in order to compel them to buy him as an investment. As Adams felt it, he was, in a manner, expected to blackmail. Many a young man complained to him in after life of the same experience, which became a matter of curious reflection as he grew old. The labor market of good society was ill organized. Boston seemed to offer no market for educated labor. A peculiar and perplexing amalgam Boston always was, and although it had changed much in 10 years, it was not less perplexing. One no longer dined at 2 o'clock. One could no longer skate on Back Bay. One heard talk of Bostonians worth 5 millions or more as something not incredible. Yet the place still seemed simple, and less restless-minded than ever before. In the line that Adams had chosen to follow, he needed more than all else the help of the press, but any shadow of hope on that side vanished instantly. The less one meddled with the Boston press, the better. All the newspaper men were clear on that point. The same was true of politics. Boston meant business. The Bostonians were building railways. Adams would have liked to help in building railways, but had no education. He was not fit. He passed 3 or 4 months thus, visiting relations, renewing friendships, and studying the situation. At 30 years old, the man who had not yet got further than to study the situation is lost, or near it. He could see nothing in the situation that could be of use to him. His friends had won no more from it than he. His brother Charles, after 3 years of civil life, was no better off than himself, except for being married and in greater need of income. His brother John had become a brilliant political leader, on the wrong side. No one had yet regained the lost ground of the war. He went to Newport and tried to be fashionable, but even in the simple life of 1868 he failed as fashion. All the style he had learned so painfully in London was worse than useless in America, where every standard was different. Newport was charming, but it asked for no education and gave none. What it gave was much gayer and pleasanter, and one enjoyed it amazingly, but friendships in that society were a kind of social partnership, like the classes at college, not education, but the subjects of education. All were doing the same thing and asking the same question of the future. None could help. Society seemed founded on the law that all was for the best New Yorkers in the best of Newports, and that all young people were rich if they could waltz. It was a new version of the ant and the grasshopper. At the end of 3 months, the only person among the hundreds he had met who had offered him a word of encouragement, or had showed a sign of acquaintance with his doings, was Edward Atkinson. Boston was cool towards sons, whether prodigals or other, and needed much time to make up its mind what to do for them, time which Adams, at 30 years old, could hardly spare. He had not the courage or self-confidence to hire an office in State Street, as so many of his friends did, and doze there alone, vacuity within and a snowstorm outside, waiting for Fortune to knock at the door, or hoping to find her asleep in the elevator, or on the staircase, since elevators were not yet in use. Whether this course would have offered his best chance, he never knew. It was one of the points in practical education which most needed a clear understanding, and he could never reach it. His father and mother would have been glad to see him stay with them and begin reading Blackstone again, and he showed no very filial tenderness by abruptly breaking that tie that had lasted so long. After all, perhaps Beacon Street was as good as any other street for his objects in life. Possibly his easiest and surest path was from Beacon Street to State Street and back again, all these days of his years. Who could tell? Even after life was over, the doubt could not be determined. In thus sacrificing his heritage, he only followed the path that had led him from the beginning. Boston was full of his brothers. He had reckoned from childhood on outlawry as his peculiar birthright. The mere thought of beginning life again in Mount Vernon Street lowered the pulsations of his heart. This is a story of education, not a mere lesson of life, and with education, temperament has in strictness nothing to do, although in practice they run close together. Neither by temperament nor by education was he fitted for Boston. He had drifted far away and behind his companions there. No one trusted his temperament or education. He had to go. Since no other path seemed to offer itself, he stuck to his plan of joining the press, and selected Washington as the shortest road to New York. But in 1868 Washington stood outside the social pale. No Bostonian had ever gone there. One announced one's self as an adventurer and an office seeker, a person of deplorably bad judgment, and the charges were true. The chances of ending in the gutter were at best even. The risk was the greater in Adams's case because he had no very clear idea what to do when he got there. That he must educate himself over again for objects quite new, in an air altogether hostile to his old educations, was the only certainty. But how he was to do it, how he was to convert the idler in Rotten Row into the lobbyist of the Capitol, he had not an idea, and no one to teach him. The question of money is rarely serious for a young American unless he is married, and money never troubled Adams more than others, not because he had it, but because he could do without it, like most people in Washington who all lived on the income of bricklayers. But with or without money, he met the difficulty that, after getting to Washington, in order to go on the press, it was necessary to seek a press to go on. For large work he could count on the North American Review, but this was scarcely a press. For current discussion and correspondence he could depend on the New York Nation, but what he needed was a New York daily, and no New York daily needed him. He lost his one chance by the death of Henry J. Raymond. The Tribune under Horace Greeley was out of the question for both political and personal reasons, and because Whitelaw Reid had already undertaken that singularly venturesome position amid difficulties that would have swamped Adams in 24 hours. Charles A. Dana had made the Sun a very successful as well as very amusing paper, but had hurt his own social position in doing it, and Adams knew himself well enough to know that he could never please himself and Dana too. With the best intentions he must always fail as a blackguard, and at that time a strong dash of blackguardism was life to the Sun. As for the New York Herald, it was a despotic empire admitting no personality but that of Bennett. Thus, for the moment, the New York daily press offered no field except the free trade Holy Land of the Evening Post under William Cullen Bryant, while beside it lay only the elevated plateau of the New Jerusalem occupied by Godkin and the Nation. Much as Adams liked Godkin, and glad as he was to creep under the shelter of the Evening Post and the Nation, he was well aware that he should find there only the same circle of readers that he reached in the North American Review. The outlook was dim, but it was all he had, and at Washington, except for the personal friendship of Mr. Evarts, who was then Attorney General and living there, he would stand in solitude much like that of London in 1861. Evarts did what no one in Boston seemed to care for doing. He held out a hand to the young man. Whether Boston, like Salem, really shunned strangers, or whether Evarts was an exception even in New York, he had the social instinct which Boston had not. Generous by nature, prodigal in hospitality, fond of young people, and a born man of the world, Evarts gave and took liberally without scruple, and accepted the world without fearing or abusing it. His wit was the least part of his social attraction. His talk was broad and free; he laughed where he could; he joked if a joke was possible; he was true to his friends, and never lost his temper or became ill-natured. Like all New Yorkers, he was decidedly not a Bostonian, but he was what one might call a transplanted New Englander, like General Sherman, a variety grown in ranker soil. In the course of life, and in widely different countries, Adams incurred heavy debts of gratitude to persons on whom he had no claim, and to whom he could seldom make return. Perhaps half a dozen such debts remained unpaid at last, although 6 is a large number as lives go. But kindness seldom came more happily than when Mr. Evarts took him to Washington in October, 1868. Adams accepted the hospitality of the sleeper with deep gratitude, the more because his first struggle with a sleeping car made him doubt the value, to him, of a Pullman civilization; but he was even more grateful for the shelter of Mr. Evarts' house in H Street, at the corner of 14th, where he abode in safety and content till he found rooms in the roomless village. To him the village seemed unchanged. Had he not known that a great war and 8 years of astonishing movement had passed over it, he would have noticed nothing that betrayed growth. As of old, houses were few, rooms fewer; even the men were the same. No one seemed to miss the usual comforts of civilization, and Adams was glad to get rid of them, for his best chance lay in the 18th century. The first step, of course, was the making of acquaintance, and the first acquaintance was naturally the President, to whom an aspirant to the press officially paid respect. Evarts immediately took him to the White House and presented him to President Andrew Johnson. The interview was brief, and consisted in the stock remark common to monarchs and valets, that the young man looked even younger than he was. The young man felt even younger than he looked. He never saw the President again, and never felt a wish to see him, for Andrew Johnson was not the sort of man whom a young reformer of 30, with 2 or 3 foreign educations, was likely to see with enthusiasm. Yet, musing over the interview as a matter of education, long years afterwards, he could not help recalling the President's figure with a distinctness that surprised him. The old-fashioned Southern Senator and statesman sat in his chair at his desk with a look of self-esteem that had its value. None doubted. All were great men; some, no doubt, were greater than others, but all were statesmen, and all were supported, lifted, inspired by the moral certainty of rightness. To them the universe was serious, even solemn, but it was their universe, a Southern conception of right. Lamar used to say that he never entertained a doubt of the soundness of the Southern system until he found that slavery could not stand a war. Slavery was only a part of the Southern system, and the life of it all, the vigor, the poetry, was its moral certainty of self. The Southerner could not doubt, and this self-assurance not only gave Andrew Johnson the look of a true President, but actually made him one. When Adams came to look back on it afterwards, he was surprised to realize how strong the Executive was in 1868, perhaps the strongest he was ever to see. Certainly he never again found himself so well satisfied or so much at home. Seward was still Secretary of State. Hardly yet an old man, though showing marks of time and violence, Mr. Seward seemed little changed in these 8 years. He was the same, with a difference. Perhaps he, unlike Adams, had at last got an education and all he wanted. Perhaps he had resigned himself to doing without it. Whatever the reason, although his manner was as roughly kind as ever and his talk as free, he appeared to have closed his account with the public. He no longer seemed to care. He asked nothing, gave nothing, and invited no support. He talked little of himself or of others, and waited only for his discharge. Adams was well pleased to be near him in these last days of his power and fame, and went much to his house in the evenings when he was sure to be at his whist. At last, as the end drew near, wanting to feel that the great man, the only chief he ever served even as a volunteer, recognized some personal relation, he asked Mr. Seward to dine with him one evening in his rooms, and play his game of whist there, as he did every night in his own house. Mr. Seward came and had his whist, and Adams remembered his rough parting speech. A very sensible entertainment. It was the only favor he ever asked of Mr. Seward, and the only one he ever accepted. Thus, as a teacher of wisdom after 20 years of example, Governor Seward passed out of one's life, and Adams lost what should have been his firmest ally. But in truth the State Department had ceased to be the center of his interest, and the Treasury had taken its place. The Secretary of the Treasury was a man new to politics, Hugh McCulloch, not a person of much importance in the eyes of practical politicians such as young members of the press meant themselves to become, but they all liked Mr. McCulloch, though they thought him a stopgap rather than a force. Had they known what sort of forces the Treasury was to offer them for support in the generation to come, they might have reflected a long while on their estimate of McCulloch. Adams was fated to watch the flittings of many more secretaries than he ever cared to know, and he rather came back in the end to the idea that McCulloch was the best of them, although he seemed to represent everything that one liked least. He was no politician; he had no party and no power; he was not fashionable or decorative; he was a banker, and toward bankers Adams felt the narrow prejudice which the serf feels to the overseer, for he knew he must obey, and he knew that the helpless showed only their helplessness when they tempered obedience by mockery. The world after 1865 became a banker's world, and no banker would ever trust one who had deserted State Street and had gone to Washington with purposes of doubtful credit or of no credit at all, for he could not have put up enough collateral to borrow $5,000 of any bank in America. The banker never would trust him, and he would never trust the banker. To him the banking mind was obnoxious, and this antipathy caused him the more surprise at finding McCulloch the broadest, most liberal, most genial, and most practical public man in Washington. There could be no doubt of it, the burden of the Treasury at that time was very great. The whole financial system was in chaos; every part of it required reform; the utmost experience, tact, and skill could not make the machine work smoothly. No one knew how well McCulloch did it until his successor took it in charge and tried to correct his methods. Adams did not know enough to appreciate McCulloch's technical skill, but he was struck at his open and generous treatment of young men. Of all rare qualities, this was, in Adams's experience, the rarest. As a rule, officials dread interference; the strongest often resent it most. Any official who admits equality in discussion of his official course feels it to be an act of virtue. After a few months or years he tires of the effort. Every friend in power is a friend lost. This rule is so nearly absolute that it may be taken in practice as admitting no exception. Apparent exceptions exist, and McCulloch was one of them. McCulloch had been spared the gluttonous selfishness and infantile jealousy which are the commoner results of early political education. He had neither past nor future, and could afford to be careless of his company. Adams found him surrounded by all the active and intelligent young men in the country, full of faith, greedy for work, eager for reform, energetic, confident, capable, quick of study, charmed with a fight, equally ready to defend or attack. They were unselfish and even, as young men went, honest. They came mostly from the army, with the spirit of the volunteers. Frank Walker, Frank Barlow, Frank Bartlett were types of the generation. Most of the press and much of the public, especially in the West, shared their ideas. No one denied the need for reform. The whole government from top to bottom was rotten with the senility of what was antiquated and the instability of what was improvised. The currency was only one example. The tariff was another. But the whole fabric required reconstruction as much as in 1789, for the Constitution had become as antiquated as the Confederation. Sooner or later a shock must come, the more dangerous, the longer postponed. The Civil War had made a new system in fact. The country would have to reorganize the machinery in practice and theory. One might discuss indefinitely the question which branch of government needed reform most urgently. All needed it enough, but no one denied that the finances were a scandal, and a constant universal nuisance. The tariff was worse, though more interests upheld it. McCulloch had the singular merit of facing reform with large good nature and willing sympathy, outside of parties, jobs, bargains, corporations, or intrigues, which Adams never was to meet again. Chaos often breeds life when order breeds habit. The Civil War had bred life; the army bred courage. Young men of the volunteer type were not always docile under control, but they were handy in a fight. Adams was greatly pleased to be admitted as one of them. He found himself much more at home with them, more at home than he ever had been before, or was ever to be again, in the atmosphere of the Treasury. He had no strong party passion, and he felt as though he and his friends owned this administration, which, in its dying days, had neither friends nor future except in them. They were not the only allies. The whole government in all its branches was alive with them. Just at that moment the Supreme Court was about to take up the legal tender cases where Judge Curtis had been employed to argue against the constitutional power of the government to make an artificial standard of value in time of peace. Evarts was anxious to fix on a line of argument that should have a chance of standing up against that of Judge Curtis, and was puzzled to do it. He did not know which foot to put forward. About to deal with Judge Curtis, the last of the strong jurists of Marshall's school, he could risk no chances. In doubt, the quickest way to clear one's mind is to discuss, and Evarts deliberately forced discussion. Day after day, driving, dining, walking, he provoked Adams to dispute his positions. He needed an anvil, he said, to hammer his ideas on. Adams was flattered at being an anvil, which is, after all, more solid than the hammer, and he did not feel called on to treat Mr. Evarts's arguments with more respect than Mr. Evarts himself expressed for them, so he contradicted with freedom. Like most young men, he was much of a doctrinaire, and the question was, in any event, rather historical or political than legal. He could easily maintain, by way of argument, that the required power had never been given, and that no sound constitutional reason could possibly exist for authorizing the government to overthrow the standard of value without necessity in time of peace. The dispute itself had not much value for him, even as education, but it led to his seeking light from the Chief Justice himself. Following up the subject for his letters to the Nation and his articles in the North American Review, Adams grew to be intimate with the Chief Justice, who, as one of the oldest and strongest leaders of the Free Soil party, had claims to his personal regard, for the old Free Soilers were becoming few. Like all strong-willed and self-asserting men, Mr. Chase had the faults of his qualities. He was never easy to drive in harness or light in hand. He saw vividly what was wrong, and did not always allow for what was relatively right. He loved power as though he were still a Senator. His position toward legal tender was awkward. As Secretary of the Treasury he had been its author; as Chief Justice he became its enemy. Legal tender caused no great pleasure or pain in the sum of life to a newspaper correspondent, but it served as a subject for letters, and the Chief Justice was very willing to win an ally in the press who would tell his story as he wished it to be read. The intimacy in Mr. Chase's house grew rapidly, and the alliance was no small help to the comforts of a struggling newspaper adventurer in Washington. No matter what one might think of his politics or temper, Mr. Chase was a dramatic figure, of high senatorial rank, if also of certain senatorial faults; a valuable ally. As was sure, sooner or later, to happen, Adams one day met Charles Sumner on the street, and instantly stopped to greet him. As though 8 years of broken ties were the natural course of friendship, Sumner at once, and after exclamation of surprise, dropped back into the relation of hero to the schoolboy. Adams enjoyed accepting it. He was then 30 years old, and Sumner was 57. He had seen more of the world than Sumner ever dreamed of, and he felt a sort of amused curiosity to be treated once more as a child. At best, the renewal of broken relations is a nervous matter, and in this case it bristled with thorns, for Sumner's quarrel with Mr. Adams had not been the most delicate of his ruptured relations, and he was liable to be sensitive in many ways that even Bostonians could hardly keep in constant mind. Yet it interested and fascinated Henry Adams as a new study of political humanity. The younger man knew that the meeting would have to come, and was ready for it, if only as a newspaper need; but to Sumner it came as a surprise, and a disagreeable one, as Adams conceived. He learned something, a piece of practical education worth the effort, by watching Sumner's behavior. He could see that many thoughts, mostly unpleasant, were passing through his mind, since he made no inquiry about any of the Adams family, or allusion to any of his friends or his residence abroad. He talked only of the present. To him, Adams in Washington should have seemed more or less of a critic, perhaps a spy, certainly an intriguer or adventurer like scores of others, a politician without party, a writer without principles, an office-seeker certain to beg for support. All this was, for his purposes, true. Adams could do him no good, and would be likely to do him all the harm in his power. Adams accepted it all, expected to be kept at arm's length, admitted that the reasons were just. He was the more surprised to see that Sumner invited a renewal of old relations. He found himself treated almost confidentially. Not only was he asked to make a fourth at Sumner's pleasant little dinners in the house on Lafayette Square, but he found himself admitted to the Senator's study and informed of his views, policy, and purposes, which was sometimes even more astounding than his curious gaps or lapses of omniscience. On the whole, the relation was the queerest that Henry Adams ever kept up. He liked and admired Sumner, but thought his mind a pathological study. At times he inclined to think that Sumner felt his solitude and, in the political wilderness, craved educated society, but this hardly told the whole story. Sumner's mind had reached the calm of water which receives and reflects images without absorbing them. It contained nothing but itself. The images from without, the objects mechanically perceived by the senses, existed by courtesy until the mental surface was ruffled, but never became part of the thought. Henry Adams roused no emotion. If he had roused a disagreeable one, he would have ceased to exist. The mind would have mechanically rejected as it had mechanically admitted him. Not that Sumner was more aggressively egoistic than other Senators, Conkling, for instance, but that with him the disease had affected the whole mind. It was chronic and absolute, while with other Senators, for the most part, it was still acute. Perhaps for this very reason Sumner was the more valuable acquaintance for a newspaper man. Adams found him most useful, perhaps quite the most useful of all these great authorities who were the stock in trade of the newspaper business, the accumulated capital of a Silurian age. A few months or years more, and they were gone. In 1868 they were like the town itself, changing but not changed. Lafayette Square was society. Within a few hundred yards of Mr. Clark Mills's nursery monument to the equestrian seat of Andrew Jackson, one found all one's acquaintance, as well as hotels, banks, markets, and national government. Beyond the square, the country began. No rich or fashionable stranger had yet discovered the town. No literary or scientific man, no artist, no gentleman without office or employment had ever lived there. It was rural, and its society was primitive. Scarcely a person in it had ever known life in a great city. Mr. Evarts, Mr. Sam Hooper of Boston, and perhaps one or two of the diplomatists had alone mixed in that sort of world. The happy village was innocent of a club. The one-horse tram on F Street to the Capitol was ample for traffic. Every pleasant spring morning at the Pennsylvania Station, society met to bid good bye to its friends going off on the single express. The State Department was lodged in an infant asylum far out on 14th Street, while Mr. Mullet was constructing his architectural infant asylum next to the White House. The value of real estate had not increased since 1800, and the pavements were more impassable than the mud. All this favored a young man who had come to make a name. In 24 hours he could know everybody; in 2 days everybody knew him. After 7 years' arduous and unsuccessful effort to explore the outskirts of London society, the Washington world offered an easy and delightful repose. When he looked around him from the safe shelter of Mr. Evarts's roof, on the men he was to work with or against, he had to admit that 9/10 of his acquired education was useless, and the other 10th harmful. He would have to begin again, from the beginning. He must learn to talk to the Western Congressmen and to hide his own antecedents. The task was amusing. He could see nothing to prevent him from enjoying it, with immoral unconcern for all that had gone before, and for anything that might follow. The lobby offered a spectacle almost picturesque. Few figures on the Paris stage were more entertaining and dramatic than old Sam Ward, who knew more of life than all the departments of the Government together, including the Senate and the Smithsonian. Society had not much to give, but what it had it gave with an open hand. For the moment, politics had ceased to disturb social relations. All parties were mixed up and jumbled together in a sort of tidal slack-water. The Government resembled Adams himself in the matter of education. All that had gone before was useless, and some of it was worse. End of chapter 16.